Israel has so consistently engaged in some of the most insane shit. Communism. You like the weekend? Thank a union for that. Thank some communists for that, okay?
The double Nakba, also referred to as the Jewish Nakba.
If the Jews didn't come from Europe after the Holocaust, they came from the surrounding Arab countries that expelled them in massive amounts following the 1948 war. In fact, there was more Jews displaced than Palestinians during the Nakba.
The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with limited competence in a particular...
This talking point attempts to convince you that there was a uniform mass expulsion of Jewish people from the MENA region following the 1947 partition of Palestine and the subsequent 1948 war for Palestine. Often referred to as the Jewish Nakba or the double Nakba, this narrative is a propaganda tool aimed at diminishing the severity of the Palestinian Nakba by falsely equating it with the experience.
It's so crazy because, like, we've explained this, so many people much more knowledgeable than myself, and I have also attempted to try and explain this concept to both Ethan and other people that engage in this kind of fucking idiotic propaganda. And yet they just like never understand it. Like half of the countries that Ethan presents in his fucking context puke, which I obviously went through in great detail on my YouTube page as well. If you want to go and watch that, it's like 8 hours long, are countries that didn't even have autonomy. Like they didn't have any sort of like real national sovereignty. They were like under the banner of French colonial occupation, for example. You know what I mean? So the notion that this was like a similar planned expulsion of Jews from all of these other countries that Arabs were in control of is insane.
Of Jews in the MENA region. By advancing this dishonest claim, the Zionist project seeks to deflect criticism of its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, shifting the focus to a supposed symmetrical event of Jewish displacement. In doing so, it attempts to absolve itself of blame and avoid responsibility for honoring the Palestinian right of return or providing compensation for what they lost. Avi Shlaim has a powerful passage refuting this harmful narrative in his book, 3 Worlds, where he writes, "The purpose of this narrative is to create a false symmetry between the fate of two communities. This narrative is not history, it's the propaganda of the victors. Honest history has to acknowledge the part played by all the governments concerned in causing this man-made tragedy. The main difference is that the Palestinian refugees, for the most part, were ethnically cleansed by the Israeli armed forces, whereas the Arab Jews, with a few exceptions, were given by the Arab governments the option of leaving or staying." This sentiment is corroborated by Israeli historian Tom Segev, who wrote, "Deciding to emigrate to Israel from one of the Arab countries was often a very personal decision, as it was in Europe. It was based on the particular circumstances of the individual's life. They were not all poor or dwellers in dark caves and smoking pits, nor were they always subjected to persecution, repression, or discrimination in their native lands. They immigrated for a variety of reasons, just as the ones who had immigrated from Europe, depending on the country, the time, the community, and the person." This suggests that Middle Eastern and North African Jews experienced a range of different living circumstances. Some were bad, some were relatively normal, in the words of Mossad agent Ifram Shiloh, who visited North Africa to gauge the situation for himself. The double Nakba theory ultimately transforms the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, or the Mizrahim, into a bargaining chip for the Zionist movement. A movement they, for the most part, originally wanted little to do with. This talking point erases the Mizrahim's rich, unique identities and, as Ella Shohat argues, imposes an Arab versus Jew binary. The double Nakba narrative relies on a racialized and monolithic understanding of both Arabs and Jews. It imagines a unified Arab world acting in concert to expel a unified Jewish people, which just isn't the case. In reality, Jewish emigration from MENA countries took place over the course of decades for many different reasons. And once those North African or Middle Eastern Jews made it to Israel, they were horribly mistreated by the racist Ashkenazi establishment. They were viewed as backward, primitive, and frequently referred to as bad human material, but more on that in a bit. This migration of Mizrahi Jews was triggered largely due to colonial Zionist settlers taking over Palestine and ethnically cleansing the native population, resulting in a reaction by other Arab communities in the region. Furthermore, the Zionist movement played a key role in speeding up the immigration of Middle Eastern Jews to Palestine. They did so through various methods, ranging from secret deals with heads of states, all the way up to false flag bombing campaigns in which Zionist actors would bomb Jewish targets in Muslim-majority countries and then blame the attacks on Muslims to instill panic and accelerate Jewish migration to Palestine. And don't worry, we will go into detail about this soon. Those who use the double Nakba talking point often leave out how the Zionist movement and the State of Israel actively put Jews across the region in positions of immense danger in order to create hostile environments for them and ultimately.
Are Arab Jews persecuted in Israel? No, not any longer. They have firmly been made a part of the in-group due to the subcategorization that we just talked about, which is that there's Arab and then there's Jew in Israel. So all of the Mizrahi population are considered a part of the Jewish in-group. There is still some level of discrimination against. There is still some level of discrimination against the like Ethiopian Jews and Black Jews in general, but it's a much larger. The much larger discrimination exists against Palestinian citizens of Israel, what the Israeli government considers to be Arab by its own designation. So non-Jews, Christians and Muslims.
Convince them to move to Palestine. To quote,
like, if you want to understand how fucking stupid this designation is, like, Armenians are considered Arab in Israel, okay? The Armenians, Christian Armenians, are considered Arab under the Israeli demographics. That's how fucking stupid it is.
Pape, the Holocaust destroyed European Jewish communities, leaving the population at 1/3 of its previous size. Moreover, most of the Jews in the US and Britain did not emigrate to Israel. They were too comfortable at home. That meant that the Zionists had to look east to populate their new Jewish state. But it was not easy to convince Arab Jews to leave countries in which they had, in many cases, been settled for centuries, if not millennia. They had prospered there, they had little experience of anti-Semitism, and felt as Arab as their neighbors. Zionists had to resort to an aggressive campaign of persuasion, often resorting to underhanded methods. Furthermore, the Jews who did move to Palestine were able to appropriate Palestinian land and property, while the Palestinians got ethnically cleansed and relegated to refugee status in perpetuity. These two situations are not symmetrical. So for this segment, we will look over specific countries in the MENA region and detail how exactly their Jewish populations withered away. This will illustrate that Jewish displacement in the region was a slow, prolonged process and the result of many different primary causes, far from this imagined synchronous expulsion of Jews by Muslims. Before we get into the specifics, it is important to understand that Jewish communities did suffer in the MENA region as a result of the Zionist movement and the animosities that flared up as a consequence. No one in their right mind would deny such a thing. There were some who wrongfully took the bait and conflated their Jewish populations with Zionism, which is exactly what the founding figures of Zionism wanted. Herzl can be quoted saying, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies." However, it's important to understand that this hostility was a reaction. This was cause and effect, not indicative of some primordial, intrinsic Arab anti-Semitism. It was the result of geopolitics. Last thing to keep in mind before we get going is that many of these MENA countries were under colonial rule during this time, so instead of just two state actors, Israel and whatever MENA country is in question, there was a third point on that triangle, the colonial power, typically France or Britain. In many cases, the colonial power actually complicated things and ultimately made the situation worse for the Jewish population living under their rule. Algeria is a good example. Algerian Jewry is probably the clearest example that debunks the whole synchronous expulsion from the Arab world narrative. What happened to them had more to do with how deeply tied they were to the French colonial system and the special treatment they got. The turning point was the Crémieux Decree of 1870, which gave French citizenship to the Jews native to Algeria, but not their Muslim, Arab, or Berber neighbors, who were kept as second-class indigenous subjects under the brutal Code de l'Indigenat. This decree completely changed the trajectory of Algerian Jews. It legally separated them from the rest of the population and tied them to France instead. They quickly adopted French language and culture, which only widened the gap between them and their Arab neighbors. Over time, this made them increasingly alienated from the growing Algerian nationalist movement, which saw them as aligned with the colonial oppressors. This, predictably, sparked some hostilities. When the Algerian War of Independence ended in 1962 and French colonial rule collapsed, nearly the entire Jewish population, about 130,000 out of 140,000, left for France, alongside over 800,000 European settlers, the Pieds Noirs. They weren't expelled by Arabs. They chose to leave because their legal status, identity, and future had been tied to France for nearly a century. They also feared that their non-Jewish neighbors would resent them for their close relations with the French oppressors, all thanks to French colonial policy. It is true that some Algerian...
Like they were given the opportunity to become Algerian citizens, and they chose to be French citizens instead. Like they chose to go with the rest of the French nationals that escaped in the aftermath of Algerian independence.
Jews found themselves in horrible living conditions, but the vast majority were perfectly fine, as Tom Segev recounts in his book.
It's wild that Americans don't know about the Algerian Revolution. I mean, is it that wild? I mean, it was so important to another anti-apartheid, anti-colonial movement, South Africa. That's why Nelson Mandela was sent to jail. He went there. He trained with the Algerian revolutionaries, and then when he came back to South Africa, they were like, "Oh, jail time for you. You're done."
Book, The First Israelis. Only 30% of the Jews of Tunisia and Algeria had to be saved. The remaining 70% were in no danger. He then points out how the situation in Morocco was comparatively worse ever since 1948, but there were still Jews living normal lives and doing all right, further illustrating that Jews in the MENA region during that time period ought not to be viewed as a monolith. If we take a closer look at Morocco and examine the reasons for Jewish emigration, things took a turn for the worse after the creation of Israel in 1948. There were riots and rising hostility, not just in Morocco, but throughout many parts of the MENA region due to the Zionists' crimes against the Palestinians and the subsequent refugee crisis that took place. Still, the Moroccan government had rules in place to prevent the immigration of Jews, specifically from 1956 to 1961. Now, this wasn't out of some love for Jews or a desire to keep them around. It was mostly about economic concerns. The key to understanding why Moroccan Jews left is Operation Yakin from 1961 to 1964. This wasn't some sudden expulsion, it was a clandestine, organized migration deal between Israel's Mossad and King Hasan II of Morocco. Israel basically paid Morocco to let Jews leave, $500,000 up front and then $100 per person for the first 50,000 people, and $250 for each person after that. So yeah, it was basically a paid population transfer. Over 3 years, close to 100,000 Moroccan Jews emigrated. Most ended up in Israel while some went to France or Canada. A lot of Moroccan Jews left by choice. Some were Zionists. Others just wanted better opportunities, but there was also immense pressure coming from the Zionist movement. Tom Segev points out that Zionist agents on the ground weren't always gentle, and in some cases, Jews, especially from rural areas in Morocco, were virtually taken aboard the ships by force. Israel needed Jews to emigrate because they needed what they referred to as human material to secure a demographic majority, exploit for labor, and fight in their wars. Even though they considered Mizrahi Jews to be bad human material, they were useful insofar as they could replace Arab labor, which the Zionists wanted none of. So when we look at what happened in Morocco, it wasn't a clear-cut expulsion or heroic rescue by the Zionists. It was kind of a backroom deal. Morocco wanted money, Israel wanted immigrants, and Moroccan Jews ended up caught in the middle. When analyzing this period in history, we can see Arab countries not only fail to act in unison in some mass expulsion, but oftentimes we can see completely different strategies coming from different Arab countries. As Segev noted, some countries encouraged Jewish migration to Israel in the hopes it would overwhelm the Israeli economy, and other countries prevented migration to Israel so that Jewish manpower couldn't be used to serve the young settler colony. Some of the Jews emigrated spontaneously, whether as a result of distress or persecution or for Zionist or religious reasons. Others came in response to the Zionist propaganda disseminated by the Zionist emissaries in their countries. Some drifted with the emigrating mass, and some actually found themselves in Israel against their will. I hope this is painting a picture that contradicts the notion of a double Nakba. Bahrain, for instance, wanted to keep their Jewish population because, as Segev wrote, the ruler believed that Islamic commandments ordered Muslims to act as protectors of Jews. The story of how Yemenite Jews migrated to Israel is an interesting yet tragic one too. The Zionist project took advantage of their faith and instilled messianic fervor among the Jews of Yemen. As Segev put it, some of them were desperately poor, subjected to oppression and discrimination, and for them, the passage to Israel was a liberation, but there were others who lived peacefully and at ease, as farmers, goldsmiths, craftsmen of all kinds, and merchants. There too, the Jews had to be encouraged to go to Israel, and there too, the messianic longings had to be organized. The way in which those longings were organized, as Segev notes, was through using local messengers who distributed missives of redemption to the Jewish communities, calling upon them to leave their homes and instructing them how to migrate. Itzhak Raphael, who headed the Jewish agency's immigration department, reported that Arabs had been hired to urge the last Jews of Yemen to depart. He did not say how the urging was done.
It's funny because like this process of consistent migration flows into Israel of Jews has not stopped because it is a inherently fascist ethno-religious superiority induced project. It requires more and more people to go and live in Israel. And the modern version of this is obviously not as sinister, if you will, but it's birthright. It's a fucking free vacation. Oh, are you a Jewish person living anywhere around the planet? Come on, just come. Free vacation. Come to Israel. You'll meet a IDF soldier on your trip and hopefully fall in love. And then you'll try to stay, hopefully stay in Israel. That's it. That's literally it. It sounds insane when you describe it, but like that is the purpose. The purpose of it is to try and get the purpose of this is to try and get people to come to Israel to see how beautiful it is, to see how wonderful it is, and basically get people to stay in Israel. And some people do. Except I don't know what the birthright system looks like currently, because I feel like for many young American Jews, I feel like they don't fuck with Israel as much as they used to.
Jewish agency emissary in Aden, Shlomo Schmidt, asked permission to propose to the Yemenite authorities that they expel the remaining Jews from their country. Once they arrived in Israel, the Yemenites received some of the worst treatment and neglect among the Middle Eastern and North African migrants, leading to illness, humiliation, and death. There was even a phenomenon of Yemenite babies going missing and turning up dead, hundreds of them. To this day, the Israeli government has not properly addressed or atoned for this tragedy known as the Yemenite children affair. Mizrahi Jews during this period were expected to leave behind their ways of life, which the Ashkenazi establishment viewed as primitive, and a European culture was forced onto them. Haaretz once published, "The peculiar tragedy with these immigrants, Jews from the MENA region, in contrast to the bad human material from Europe," meaning Holocaust survivors, they referred to them as bad human material too, by the way, "is that there is nothing to hope for from their children either." Nothing like the quote-unquote safe haven for Jews calling Mizrahis and Holocaust survivors.
Like there's two different forms of domination because there's also a racial pecking order within Zionism amongst Jews as well. Like it's a double racist. If you're Ethiopian, triple racist is crazy. On the one hand, Israel needs a constant migration of Jews from all around the world to go to Israel and to repopulate Israel with Jewish babies. But then also at the same time, there's like an internal racial pecking order amongst Jews as well. With Jews from Yemen being at the bottom of that totem pole until recently, I would say, like now it's the Ethiopian Jews, or I guess technically Jews in Uganda who are not even allowed to immigrate into Israel. So technically they're the lowest of the low, so much so that they're like actively do not want them in Israel. But I guess you could say that about Ethiopian Jews as well. But it's crazy. What he's going to describe to you is something that I've talked about a lot here as well. It's what Americans and Canadians did to the indigenous population through like residential schools. Like it's a practice of just basically stealing children and then giving them to good crop families, white Ashkenazi Jewish families that were better integrated into the Western-focused Israeli society that was developing.
Bad human material. Let's look quickly at Iraq before we end this segment. I've spoken ad nauseum about the Jewish emigration from Iraq on this channel. This video will go more in depth, but as a quick summary, Jews lived in the land known today as Iraq for millennia. As we've been over, they held positions of status and authority, and for the most part, were respected pillars of the community prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. The Zionist movement changed that, and, quoting Segev, in some places, the Zionist awakening worsened the situation of the Jews. Iraq was one of those places. Segev goes as far as to claim that, at least in the beginning, animosity toward Jews in Iraq was targeted solely at Zionists, not Jews, and the distinction was being made. The Mossad's files abound with telegrams reporting the persecution of Jews in Iraq, but almost all of them refer to Jews who have been involved in the activities of the Zionist underground or who were suspected of belonging to it. There was little harassment of other Jews. But as things progressed in Iraq, the line between Jew and Zionist blurred. Pan-Arab nationalism was growing in Iraq for two main reasons. One, Iraq was under British colonial influence, and many Iraqis despised that. Since the British were the main sponsor of the Zionist project and were responsible for documents like the Balfour Declaration, some Iraqi nationalists perceived the Jews as in cahoots with the Brits, especially since the British, and the French in other instances, gave Jews preferential treatment out of the belief that they would be less susceptible to nationalist movements that would threaten colonial power. Second, the settler colonial project in Palestine, which had been underway since the 1800s, increased animosity toward Jews in the MENA region, who were perceived by some to be somehow responsible for the atrocities committed by the Zionist settlers and militias. Now, this was obviously incredibly unfair for many reasons, one of which was that many Mizrahi Jews, specifically in Iraq, wanted nothing to do with Zionism. As Avi Shlaim recounts a conversation he had with his 91-year-old mother in which he asked her about Zionism, she replied with, "Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It had nothing to do with us." In 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law called the Denaturalization Law, in which Jews could register to leave the country and go to Israel. However, not many Jews signed up for this. For the most part, they didn't want to leave Iraq. But remember, the State of Israel needed that precious human material. So what did the Zionists do? Well, they bombed Jewish targets in Iraq to speed up the emigration process and scare the Jews into registering to leave the country for Israel. This campaign was fairly effective. As Shlaim wrote, there was a direct correlation between the bombings and the rise in the number of applicants to emigrate from Iraq. This bombing campaign was carried out by the Zionist underground and blamed on Muslims. There were many bombs that went off in Iraq during this period, and most of them were done by Zionists, according to Avi Shlaim, who, in his book 3 Worlds, provides what he calls undeniable proof. However, it's important to understand that this bombing campaign was not the only reason for Jewish emigration to Israel. That's not Shlaim's argument. He concedes that the atmosphere in Iraq was genuinely becoming hostile for Jewish Iraqis due to the Zionist project, and that shouldn't be swept under the rug. Shlaim's point is that the Zionist project acted belligerently and dangerously with the goal of turning Jewish people across the region into pariahs or making them feel unsafe so they would move to Israel. A similar false flag bombing campaign, albeit a failed one, took place in 1954 Egypt, where a number of Egyptian Jews were arrested for planting bombs in public spaces and in the U.S. Information Service offices in Cairo and Alexandria. This was an Israeli false flag operation designed to create bad blood between the revolutionary regime headed by Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Western powers. Israel's military intelligence had recruited...
Bro, God. Dude. Israel has so consistently engaged in some of the most insane shit, which they still do to this day. Total violation of whatever fucking norms that people think they have. I mean, even the fucking the beeper attack, which is an insane act of terrorism, was applauded, was celebrated in Western media like it was fucking so ingenious. When you had Leon Panetta, former CIA head Leon Panetta, being like, "What the fuck are you guys talking about? This is so unimaginably psychotic. There are very well defined rules in the rule books that we designed so that nobody does this, because you create an environment of uncertainty around like regular commodities that people fucking consume. This is like, if turned into a similar violent act against like Western powers, we'd understand it as terrorism." Is one of those things. Like, there are certain norms that countries abide by, and Israel has routinely violated those norms from its beginning all the way to its end, basically. And one of them is just, you don't assassinate heads of state. Obviously, America sometimes violates that as well, but like Israel doing it is like doubly fucked, because Israel is not America, right? It's supposed to be this sovereign nation state.
Recruited, trained, and equipped the Jewish spy and sabotage ring. The Israeli officer in charge, Mayor Max Bennett, the same Max Bennett who had directed the false flag operations in Baghdad a few years earlier. Another sick aspect of the double Nakba theory is that it makes Palestinians pay for the wrongdoings of others. If an Arab in Iraq or Yemen or Egypt turns on his Jewish neighbor, why should a Palestinian be punished for that? Arabs, like Jews, are not a monolith. The experience of a French citizen Jew in Algeria choosing to move to France is not the equivalent to that of an Iraqi Jew fleeing Baghdad after a false flag bombing campaign, nor is it the same as a Yemeni Jew being airlifted to Israel amid a wave of messianic fervor stoked by Zionist emissaries. Nor does it resemble the experience of Jews who sought refuge in Lebanon, which was considered a relative safe haven after 1948. And when Lebanese Jews eventually chose to leave due to civil war and economic instability, they primarily moved to the US and Europe, not Israel. In fact, as Dr. Kirsten E. Schultz, author of The Jews of Lebanon, wrote, most Lebanese Jews were in complete agreement with the Arabs that Zionism and its endeavors in the land of Israel were the cause of all troubles. All that said, I'll conclude with this. The Jews from the MENA region emigrated to Israel for a variety of reasons. Some were fleeing poverty and discrimination. Some moved against their will. Many went to Europe, the US, and Canada, and many went to Israel. The ones who found themselves in Israel were unjustly discriminated against, not by Arabs, but by European Jews. Nonetheless, they were still able to expropriate Palestinian land and settle there, while Palestinians got ethnically cleansed. When an absolute moron like this guy tries to tell you that the Nakba was actually more devastating for Jews than Palestinians, he's engaging in a form of Nakba denialism.
Holocaust denialism. It's the same. It's fascism through and through. You know, you got to deny historic atrocities, of course, if you want to justify your fascist ideology, your fascist worldview.